record. And before we invite our speaker to share her slides and talk to us today, we will do a little introduction. So Dr. Maria Urso is an experienced medical affairs professional with demonstrated success at the benchtop and in the pharmaceutical and medical device industry. She is accomplished in developing and executing medical and scientific strategies that capitalize on data of value, align with commercial strategies and tactics, and build influential KOL and KAL networks. Since earning her PhD in muscle physiology and biochemistry in 2006, she has served as a research scientist in the US Army, has held several manager and director roles in medical affairs, and has participated in professional speaking opportunities, including today's talk. In this session, Dr. Urso will talk about succeeding in medical affairs with a focus on what you can do while in the MSL role to learn as much as you can, and how to effectively connect with internal stakeholders and engage with mentors. She will also discuss the MSL career ladder for those who are interested in progressing a career as an MSL or to a different role in medical affairs. So she's excited to share her opportunities and to walk our audience through their questions about career paths and opportunities in medical affairs. And with that, I will turn it over to Maria, and she'll share a few slides, and then we'll jump right into the Q&A that everybody submitted for today's session.
Great. Thank you so much, Renee, and thank you, Lindsay. And I'm thanking you on behalf of everyone who's here. And like I said beforehand, I know some of you have probably tuned in the past, but what a valuable resource this is to be able to tune in and have the open Q&A to submit questions in advance and just get to speak to people all across medical affairs. I mean, this is just the return that you get from this is fantastic. And there's a YouTube channel. And the other thing I love is seeing people that I've seen in other webinars, George. It's just really nice to have this network. And it's great that everyone's sticking together, because one thing that I definitely want to touch upon today is it's a pretty small world. And, you know, almost every person who applies for something, especially once you start moving up, it turns out that you have someone in common, or there's something that you've heard about them, whether it was someone you've worked with in the past, either in an academic setting or in a different role. So it's really great to stay connected, because you're going to be able to lean on each other throughout your careers if you're not already. So what Renee and Lindsay did, as you know, they had questions that they requested beforehand. And what I did was I put some slides together that are related to the different bins that we had. So they categorized the questions under 3 categories. So the first one is for those who are new to medical affairs. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. The first group of questions is for those who are new to medical affairs or even the MSL role, or who are looking to break into the MSL role. The second group is, once you've broken into medical affairs, what can you do to create the biggest impact, or to do the best in that role that you have, but also to start planning for the rest of your career trajectory. And then the final one is medical affairs leadership and mentorship, which is, I think, probably the most important. And I was surprised we only had 2 questions around that. So maybe after we have a little discussion today, we can open it up and have some more Q&A. So before we jumped into the Q&A, I just wanted to open up with 2 slides that I feel like are so important no matter what you do. And the very first one is trying to figure out if medical affairs, because I know some of you are finishing up your studies, is even the right path for you. And that takes a lot of internal, let me look at what I've excelled at where I am in my career, and what I'm excelling at now, and what I really just hate doing, and what I maybe can't imagine making so much of my day-to-day work. And I'd have to say, when it comes to industry, you have to really ask, are you more interested in products or knowledge? For no other factor that there's always a profit motive when it comes to industry. Granted, as medical science liaisons and medical affairs, our role is to provide scientific value, clinical education, scientific education, but it really does come down to the value we bring back to the company is how we sell that scientific evidence and how we sell that scientific data. The other one is, are you more interested in fast tracking your findings or fully understanding a phenomenon? So industry, you hear it, if you're not already in it, things move really fast. They move very quickly. I used to be everything had to be absolutely perfect before I submitted it. There's just no room for that in industry. You need to do a great job. You need to submit high quality work, but things get turned around really, really quickly. If you're someone who really wants to get to the bottom of something and just continue to, analyze every bit and continue to ask those questions to get the most granular aspect, it might not be the best area for you. The other one, which kind of has two ways that you can go, and it will you be frustrated if your research freedom is limited? So in industry, you go from where you're kind of deciding what your clinical research or your scientific research or your clinical path is going to look like. It is going to be limited in industry, whether it's what you can talk about, what you can engage in, how you can collaborate, or even sometimes what you can speak to or how you can speak to that. You may want to speak at a conference, but are you allowed to talk about certain things? This could be if you're interested in going into R&D and research. So in industry. So if you go into R&D and you do have limited research freedom, but you have to work on a very specific problem, you could be a monumental player on that R&D team. So that's where it can become an asset. You need to be comfortable with rapidly changing missions and courses of action. One of the things that I find my team gets frustrated, or any team gets frustrated with, is when, I'm a runner, so I always liken everything. I use it on the marathon scale. It says if you ran 26 miles in the marathon and you only have 0.2 miles left, and they say, you know what, I need you to go back to the beginning and run that in a red shirt instead of a blue shirt. And you're like, wait a minute, I did everything right. I made it to mile 26. And it's like, yeah, but we really need that to be done in a blue shirt. So it's really, sometimes you may put a lot of work and a lot of effort into something and you get to almost that end game and you have to change course. The last thing I want to ask is, have you done your research? Don't interview just to get a foot in the door. You have to have some passion and excitement. That's picked up by the interview panel. And I have to say, never show up for an interview unless you have some basic intel around the top three: product, people, and the press. So what's the product? You don't need to read all the material around it. Just have a general knowledge of what that product is, who the specialties are. So what is the type of physicians that you will be calling on? What disease state is it in? Again, is there bad press against it? Is there good press? Was there a new acquisition? Was there a new growth? Was there a new sale? And then also the people. So who are you interviewing with? And you're all on LinkedIn now. I know that's how you found out about this. So do your due diligence before an interview to show up for that. So the last thing I just wanted to talk about before we jumped into your questions in the Q&A are just these things. And the reason why I made a slide about it is because I think these are things, I kind of have a little image of this that I look at in my notebooks and I have it on my desk, because it's really good to do this pulse check all the time when you consider your career path. Simple things like, where do you want to live? Is it related to a family situation? Do you have the ability to relocate? Do you want to live someplace cold? Do you want to be able to have easy access to the mountains? Do you want to live on the beach? That's going to be a big aspect, whether you're a remote employee or whether you have to be in-house. Are you willing to relocate? Right now with the pandemic, there's a lot of positions that are willing to not only relocate people, but change inside medical affairs role to a remote position. So there's an advantage there that we didn't used to have. Again, always asking what drives you, what your strengths are. So for some people, and I talked to Lindsay and Renee about this before we started, is some people just want to be an MSL. They want to be the best MSL on any team. And that's where they want to stop. They don't want to manage people. They have no interest in managing people. They don't want to work on this, developing the strategy and executing the strategy. They truly want to be the best MSL. And that's great. That's an absolutely great role and a place to stay. So do you want to move up into a leadership role, or do you want to stay where you are? Thinking about the schedule you prefer, I'd have to say as an MSL, your schedule is a bit more autonomous, especially when you are out in the field. You can always probably get past something. You do have to work a little bit later sometimes. You might get stuck flying, delayed flights. You might have to make up for stuff on the weekends. When you are working in a more management position, your schedule is going to have to be pretty wide open, especially if you have MSLs or direct reports that span time zones. Not just US time zones, but across countries. So I always used to say it's kind of like you're on call, because you could be waking up to things if you are across countries and across big time zones, and you could be going to sleep at 10 o'clock where it's only 7 o'clock somewhere and they have a missed flight or an emergency. Knowing what you're physically capable of, how big your territory is when you're managing an MSL team, You may have to manage a national MSL team. You may be doing field rides across the nation. If you think about that, even a team of 8 MSLs, if you want to do a field ride with every MSL per quarter, you are going to be traveling probably once a week if you factor in your corporate responsibilities and the corporate travel that you'll have to do to headquarters. Asking if you prefer large or small company dynamics, very different. I know that I love coming into something that's not quite developed. I love everything around the SOPs, figuring out a strategy, figuring out the tactics. If something's not developed, like the launch of a product to me is so exciting. Who are we going to call on? How are we going to develop it? What's the clinical care pathway? What publications will be fed into that? That's much more of a small or mid-sized company type activity. Whereas with a larger company, you're going to be executing on a strategy that's pretty well defined for you. And then the aspects of your skill set that appeal to you most. So I just wanted to talk about those things first. Put these down, and it's definitely something that's worth thinking about on a consistent basis, because I feel like almost like with a relationship or just you as a human, you're not the same person you were 5 years ago. And in your career, the more you learn, the more experiences you have, your answers to these may not be the same. So with that, we can jump into some of the Q&A. And I'm going to stop screen sharing just until we have some lists to go over.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think all of those questions are so pivotal in just making sure you're keeping your head exactly where you want to be in your job search and figuring out, exactly which position is right for you. And sometimes people get lost in the search and they think that it's just one track and one track only, but there's definitely a lot of options, which is a good segue into our first question that people submitted. Either those who are new to medical affairs or trying to figure out how they can break in. We get this question almost every session, but I think it's fitting in terms of the themes and the topics that you just pointed out. So our first question is, can you go into medical affairs without MSL experience? Or what kind of job title would I look for in that case? And I actually think you have a good slide about this too, if you want to share again.
I do. I have a great slide because I think I start to rattle off job titles and it was like, wait, talk slower. Yeah. So just as an outset, some people who say I want to be an MSL and I only want to be an MSL, you know that you keep getting that, do you have MSL experience? And so there's definitely opportunity to start in a medical affairs role to get industry experience. And with that, you can start to get HCP connections, so start to have some interactions with healthcare providers and just see like the nuts and bolts of industry and how it works. So absolutely, it's possible to get a foot in the door. And then I do have, I'll share my slide for this one, but another thing to think about is as you craft your CV, when you're applying for these roles, stop focusing on you and what you've done. Not stop, I mean, that's very important, but make sure that you include how what you've done is going to contribute to the mission of medical affairs and being an MSL. So yes, it's really wonderful if you've published a lot, but if you can highlight that maybe you had to collaborate with academic centers to do that, and you have relationships with key academic centers, that walking in the door, if you have no MSL experience, at least we know in that territory, you have key academics that you have a relationship with, you know the scientific congresses that are important and people you can start calling on. But other roles outside of an MSL, medical information, and I know that any MSL team I've worked on or been with, they work very closely with MedInfo. So MedInfo is like the in-house team that's providing those answers to the questions. And I've also worked where people transition from a medical information role and they move out to an MSL role. So that's a great way. Evidence generation and publication planning, fantastic way to understand corporate strategy and what the initiatives are. So what type of papers are we publishing? What are they in line with? What's the optimal experimental design to achieve the primary outcome that we're looking for that will help support our product. Medical writing is good. One of the things that I would say if you are going to do medical writing is try and be a kind of a liaison or a support system for HCPs who like to write or want to write and need a professional writer for them. And that way you already come in with a network of HCPs. Any of you with research experience, so PhDs, health economic and outcome specialist is a great role to look for. You can use your statistics and modeling and everything else to help with corporate initiatives. Clinical affairs, so there's no better way to start interacting with research sites, academic centers, large practices, hospitals, and health systems than in the clinical affairs pathway. Grant specialist is good. It's a great way to develop relationships. Those are enduring relationships. So if you do have a role as a grant specialist, being able to advertise that you didn't just review a grant and dole out money according to corporate strategy, but you had to continually check in with these providers and maintain and build upon that relationship. Patient advocacy, and then corporate advocacy and alliance relations. And those are usually roles that if there's a professional society, so for example, if you are in the wound care space or dermatology, there's the American Association for Wound Care, you're kind of that liaison between them and, how can our corporate initiatives align with your society initiatives and alliance relations. So those are different options. Feel free to, write these down, and you can see these on a lot of career pages.
Yeah, I think those are great examples. As Renee said, that's definitely a very common question, is how can I start to get some sort of industry or medical affairs experience without having any? So I think those are some really great examples you outlined for us. Moving on to our next question, which is still related. So let's say you land your first MSL position, you've never had MSL experience. How can you, as a new MSL, provide value to your managers or to the team early on, despite not having much experience in the role?
Just to kind of put it into a soundbite is not so much focusing on the me, but focusing on the we and the you. How can you help your team? It's very rare that you're going to be only MSL on a team. And chances are that your manager has many MSLs that all have different challenges, depending on if they're in a rural area, if they're in an urban area. So figuring out a way that you can contribute, that you can help. And something that I learned very early on, it goes back to my military days, is problem, solution, resolution. And I ask my teams of that all the time. If you have a problem, I want you to just take a minute to figure out some potential solutions and what that perfect resolution would look like, and bring it to me that way. And I will look to you as my problem solver, because we're solving it together. It may not be the correct solution. It may not even be a feasible solution, but at least you're not always saying problem, 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 problem. So really just being someone who can help, move that needle and move those initiatives, I'd have to say is probably one of the best things that you can do.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And that's actually something that I'm going through right now, is just making sure that I'm positioning myself in a way that will be, most effective or most helpful to the others on my team. Even if I don't know what that is yet, I'll just position myself so that I'm sort of at the forefront and willing to help in whatever way I can.
Yeah,
it's definitely a concern when you don't know how you can help. It's hard to offer help until you learn.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our next question, in terms of, so you're networking on the job. So you're building relationships with KOLs and with your team and internally, but how can you make sure you're effectively building on networking for yourself in terms of your own professional development while you're in the role?
So probably the biggest thing that you can do is take part in as many things as possible. Attend as many congresses. I know that's been so difficult, but you can still attend webinars, even doing something like this and increasing your network, starting to see familiar faces, people that you can reach out to. Social media is so helpful in that sense. LinkedIn is great. Even on Twitter, following influencers in either your disease space or following influencers who just in general, from a health perspective, maybe a public health perspective, that have a platform, that have a really great platform. I'm pretty confident that in every disease space, there's someone that is quite vocal and they're very good at it, that they almost get a following. And those are the type of people that, to align with. The biggest thing that I can say as far as how you're operating and executing, don't be afraid to do things alone. Something that we do, especially if you're a part of a big team, is you go to these congresses and you tend to just stick with the people you know from your company. And that's just not a great idea. Right now, it's probably awesome because you haven't seen them face to face. Some of them you probably never even met before because they did their interview virtually. But being able to go off on your own, meeting with as many people as you possibly can, then that conversation is going to be organic and you're going to be able to talk about as many different things. You're not going to feel like someone's waiting for you. You're not having that awkward conversation with 3 friends standing behind you, especially if it is a healthcare provider or someone from an advocacy organization, because they tend to feel a little ganged up on when a couple people from industry or the same area, are approaching them together. So not being afraid to kind of go it alone and ask those questions. And the very last thing is, if your company, some companies do offer professional development, you can take a course or you can attend a meeting from a different professional society. Definitely go to those, go to the exhibit hall, speak to recruiters, get that network so that if you are ever in the position where you are looking for a new role, you have such a huge network to reach out to.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds like really good advice to always be focusing on building your network. I know that Renee and I try to emphasize that as well. And I think people are definitely doing that by attending webinars like this. All right, so moving on to the next question, could you speak on what are some common mistakes to avoid when you're in your new role?
Oh, the very first one is if you are in an MSL role, there's so many mistakes you can make when onboarding. And the very first one I have to say is walk in the door being humble. I know that you want to come in, and especially if it is your first MSL role, you want to show everyone that you belong there, but you wouldn't have been hired if you don't belong there. So you have to tuck that little confidence card in your pocket that you belong on this team just as much as anybody else on that team because you made it through the interview process. So don't go into onboarding anything else but humble. It's always more than you anticipate. You say, oh, there's 3 or 4 papers. I kind of have to understand them. I'll do great. And once you start diving in, especially if there's a lot of publications behind your product, you will be overwhelmed very quickly. There tend to be open book exams or different exams. And if you're onboarding with someone else, there's a little bit of competition there. There tend to be role playing where you have to do Q&A. And I know I'm someone, I'll be like, oh, I know all the information. I read the paper. It's all in my head, packed up there. But then when you have to verbalize it, you just fail miserably. And then when you get to that first role play, you just are humbled instantly. So the very first thing I have to say is be humble. And the second one is protect that onboarding time. When you first get into the company, the first 2 days, do all your compliance things, do all your paperwork, do all those little things that are going to slip away from you, because a great way to set a bad impression is 30 days in when your manager says, this person is overdue on these 8 trainings, you have that protected time in the beginning. So do your training, protect that time. And if you are going from, it is your first MSL role or anything where you're going from working in-house to now you're working remotely, it's really easy for the day to get away from you. So make a schedule and stick to it, and definitely put lots of breaks in that schedule. Don't say, oh, you know what? It's a beautiful day today. I'm just going to take the day on the beach and I'll just double study tomorrow. It's, from your academic careers, it's really hard to double study. There's your brain is like a sponge. There's only so much you could put in. So I'd have to say those are my big, common mistakes to avoid.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. The amount of information you're handed is just extremely overwhelming. So staying focused and spacing things out and making sure you stay on task is definitely something that I would say too. So just a quick transition. Our final question in the new to medical affairs section was submitted by somebody who wrote, I'm a new MSL and I'm looking to get a broader understanding of how MSLs interact with different functional groups within a pharma organization. What cross-functional projects or groups do you see MSLs commonly get involved in?
Great. I'm going to share a screen because, again, this was another one that had quite a substantial list to it. I love this question because if you want to show your value to the company, you can be a rock star MSL on your own. You know, I always say when you're an MSL, you're kind of running your own business. It's your territory, it's your customers, it's the people that you speak to. But being able to tell everybody else at that company what you're doing and how you can bring value to them and their pillars makes you truly an incredible MSL or a medical affairs person. So some of the cross-functional activities that you can take part in, and look for these, ask for these, you know, ask your manager, definitely volunteer for them. You're doing well when your manager says no. you're signed up for enough extra activities right now. I need you to not do more. But some great cross-functional activities are the medical information team has to write a lot. Everything from FAQs to standard response letters. If you can serve as a reviewer for those materials, you get to be like the fact checker. You get to make sure that every little bit of information is in there and it's accurate. So it's kind of like a way to keep your skills and your knowledge fresh. If you are a great presenter and there's an opportunity to help with sales training, I was in 2 different roles where that was something I was able to do, and I loved it. And I have to say that definitely increased my credibility company-wide, because at sales training, you have individuals from different pillars of the company, especially in leadership roles. So if you're a great presenter, if you can teach, if you can break something down that's really high-level science into something fun and digestible, see if you can take part in any sales training. That's a great way to stand out. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of time, but it really, you know, is worth its weight in gold. Work with the market access team. So a lot of times they'll have to present to payers and health systems about the value of the product. Well, they can speak to the economics. They're probably going to have to speak to a chief medical officer about the data. And that's your wheelhouse. So if you can, you know, align with your market access teams and speak about data, the publications, you know, how the providers can use your product, that's probably the best way. Insights, that is our currency as MSLs. So collecting insights. What are you hearing in the field? We are the boots on the ground. We're about 1% of the company that's, aside from sales, that gets to go out in the field every single day and ask lots of questions and gains tons and tons of intelligence. So that's probably the greatest value you bring back. When you get those insights, be that squeaky wheel. Make sure that, you know, your insights that you're tracking, first of all, make sure there's business impact and they're relevant, and put them in, make sure they're concise, and make sure you track them to make sure they get to the appropriate person as far as being solution-minded. Clinical affairs teams, you can help with everything from site identification, insights related to patient recruitment, enrollment, retention. Again, being a squeaky wheel. I know that after the pandemic, it was really hard to enroll patients. I mean, patients didn't want to go see their provider for cancer screenings, let alone for a bonus visit to enroll in a clinical trial where they'd get a Starbucks gift card. So we really needed to have MSLs in the field at these sites. Just, again, relationship building. You know, what can we do to help you? What's working? What's not working? And then again, you get a lot of insights on trial design, that something's working very well with the patients or something's not working very well, or they're in a competitive clinical trial and this is what the competitor's doing that's working really well. So you can be a true asset for your clinical affairs team. Identifying key societies and ways that medical and other teams can collaborate. This is a big one. A lot of times these societies are the ones who write the guidelines. So if there's a guideline that you're not yet in, or your positioning in that guideline is not optimal, or you want to make sure you stay in those guidelines, making sure that you have a consistent dialogue with those societies is key. Again, pipeline and R&D teams, bringing back any insights. I read something several times over that a lot of times product development, you know, maybe they have 1 or 2 ad boards with providers and they're not getting that continued input throughout the product development phase. So you are someone, again, boots on the ground, talking to those providers who can bring back those insights about optimal design and clinical care pathways. And finally, Congress planning. So it's very rare that only medical affairs personnel go to a Congress. Usually companies have a booth there that's staffed by everything from the marketing individuals to sales personnel. So be a key person involved in the Congress planning. I know budgets don't always send entire MSL teams to all big conferences, but they do allow for MSLs to take part in other, you know, remote activities, whether it's helping to cull abstracts to find out, you know, of 2,000 abstracts and posters being presented, which ones do we want to focus on? So that's how you can bring value to the cross-functional teams.
Yeah, that's an awesome list. I didn't even realize all of the things that you could help with and be involved with. So that was a really great list.
And ask questions. Like, you can always ask. Yeah, there's so many opportunities. You know, I interviewed someone who was trying to break into the MSL role, who did. It was a happy ending. And one of the things that they did, they were an intern at a company, and they just asked if they could do ride-alongs with the sales personnel. And in that, they picked up intelligence that they brought back. And so they showed their value to the company they're interning with. And that turned out to be a key nugget of discussion during the interview. So just asking and putting yourself out there, you probably have, so even though it wasn't on that slide, there's plenty more things that you can do to contribute.
Right, yeah. All right, so our next section that we're going into now, we're calling it After Breaking into Medical Affairs. So to start off those questions, our first question is, what are things one can be doing during their first few years of being an MSL to be a competitive candidate in the job market?
So back to one of the things I spoke about individually is it's a small world. And so acting with integrity is the best thing you can do. When you're working remote, there's plenty of things that can distract you, and there's plenty of temptations that you can probably swing and make work. I say worse because that's what I'm thinking in my head. So I have to say is operating with integrity as an MSL is number one. Even in your MSL role, is if your company gets dinged for a compliance issue, it is millions. It is such a penalty. It makes the news. And for you to do something like that, it will never go away. It's something that will follow you. So you want to make sure that you are always above board, that you always operate with integrity. You know the SOPs. If you have a question about how to do something compliantly, ask it. And never, ever worry about saying no to someone on the promotional side of the house if it doesn't feel right. So I have to say that's the biggest thing I have to say. I know you want to talk about the good things you can do, but there's things we don't think about. And so you always want to make sure you do the right thing, because sometimes it seems innocuous. You know, a salesperson's like, oh, no one will notice if we both have dinner with this provider together. Yeah, but maybe someone sitting in that restaurant works for the FDA. You know, it sounds so slim, but the stories I've heard and the unfortunate things that have happened. So that's the first thing I have to say. The other thing is just really building your network, building your professional network, and building your network in your area. If you don't love the disease state that you're in, so for example, you really just wanted to break into an MSL role, you weren't looking for a specific area, you got into, let's say, the cardiovascular space, and it's mostly devices, you like it, but you know what? Sometimes it's a lot of hours because you have to be around during surgeries, and surgeries are the most unpredictable things in the whole world. So make sure that, you try things out. And when you find, and I think that's a good example, oncology is another one. If you have to be there while medications are being delivered, you have a very different MSL role than someone who's just calling on providers for 30-minute visits throughout the day, and they can end their day whenever they choose. So I think you need to take the time to, once you find that you're burnt out, to get out. Because what happens is you can kind of have a misstep and not do as well as you'd like. So once you start to lose that passion and that fire in you is going away, take a pause, reassess. Is it the disease state? Is it the demands on your time? Is your territory too big? Do you want to maybe have a smaller territory, and really make those switches? So I think in your early years, just so you don't mess up, is to continue to be honest with yourself and ask those questions.
I think that's really great advice, and you're tapping right into the next question that we have. So in your experience, what have you seen as one of the most common, or some of the most common reasons that people tend to either want to explore other roles or switch out of the MSL role, and be it to another role within pharma or outside of the pharmaceutical industry? What are your thoughts on that, and what have you seen most commonly?
From MSLs, I've seen everything from my territory is too small to my territory is too big. So some were like, I thought I'd be an MSL and I'd get to travel all over the land, and they want to do something more international. So they've moved on or moved out for that reason. And also vice versa is, my other MSL friend gets to drive to all their appointments and never has to stay at a hotel. And I'm gone, almost every night because I have such a huge territory. So I think that is the biggest thing. I'd have to say it's probably an 80-20 breakdown. 80% is the travel's too much and my territory is too big, is the biggest reason I tend to see. The other is it's kind of hard. And I'm speaking more to PhDs because I can sympathize with that a little bit more than with PharmDs or someone who comes from a clinical background. It's very hard that first year moving from something that's been your life, whether you are writing papers and you're the one doing the research, you're coming up with the great ideas, or you're treating the patient, and you're now in a role where you are in a box as far as what you can speak to. And you can't talk to the patients anymore, like not in the same way. So it's almost that you made that switch and then it really wasn't everything it cracked up to be. And the things you were passionate about, whether it is being at the benchtop or treating patients, it's just, you miss that connection. And then the other thing I've seen done internally for medical affairs, I know my thing is I've always been motivated by strategy. I love coming up with strategy. I love taking risks. I love looking at, this white piece of paper and figuring out what we need to focus on, how we're going to focusing on, and coming up with like this nice plan to execute on it. So for me, I was fine as an MSL because you need strategy. I needed to look at a territory. I needed to look at all the moving pieces. Who was I going to call on? Why was I going to call on it? But I wanted to go bigger. I wanted it to fit more into the corporate structure.
So building off of that a little bit, you just started to mention it. Did you have like an aha moment that made you want to transition out of the MSL role, or did you kind of just find yourself in these new positions? And how long did it take you to start to feel comfortable in the other positions that you took?
Yeah, I feel like these are two different ways. The very first one is I never had an aha moment because I more had a serendipitous moment. I started at benchtop scientist. I worked for government. I did research. And it was who I did research with, started their company. I moved into that company. I directed clinical affairs, and I liked the MSL role and the company I was with. It just it wasn't quite the right time for me. And so I ended up in an MSL role. And then out of a series of events, I moved into more leadership roles. And I think it was always because I was driven towards that. So I never had an aha moment. It was more just, I was in a place at a time where it made sense for my career and what I wanted to do. Like I had a lot of right fit moments. I'd have a lot more right fit moments. As far as the second part, I've never felt comfortable in any role. And I think that's a really good thing. And I can speak to this because I have a great analogy. And you remember when you had to give your first talk and you had every slide and you had your talking points under it and you practiced it like 10 times and you gave a stellar talk, like that talk was amazing. Well, what happens is the further along you get and the more talks you give, you stop making your slides in advance, you stop writing notes, you might wing it. And what you end up doing is you're too comfortable. And when you're too comfortable, you stop growing. You don't give amazing talks anymore. You give passable talks. You talk too long, you talk off topic. And I just feel like when I get comfortable, I get complacent. So I've never felt comfortable in a role. And I also think that's because I'm always looking for what's next and what more. But I also think that's a product of industry. Industry is not stagnant. If it is, you're going to tank. And so industry is always changing. You think just when you have your role figured out, they're splitting your team or you're getting acquired or you have a new product coming out of the pipeline. So I've never felt comfortable, but I think it's the greatest thing because I feel like it calluses your mind. If you've heard that one, it makes you stronger and more adept at pivoting.
Yeah, I think that's all really great advice, and not feeling comfortable in a role definitely resonates with me. And so a lot of people actually on this call had this same question. So what are some of those common roles that people tend to move on to after MSL? So we talked a lot about what you do before MSL, but whether it's a management role or a leadership role or even something else in medical affairs, would you mind speaking to that?
Yeah, so some great roles. One is just, you're a senior MSL or, a leader, or associate director or a director of an MSL team. That's probably the biggest, course of trajectory. If you don't want to manage people, sometimes you are a senior MSL that has a different sort of job description where you just have a key responsibility. So you manage your territory, but maybe you are the liaison to the market access team and you're doing a lot behind market access work or alliance work, or there's a new initiative with CMS that you're working on. So sometimes the senior MSL roles have that. Trainers, so educators, like I said, as you're doing your MSL work, you find that you do sales training and you just, blow up the room and everyone thinks you're amazing. People move into medical affairs to do training. But then there's also medical affairs operations, which having your MSL base behind you, where you have this huge network and you know the lay of the land and the landscape, medical affairs operations is a cool role. It's internal, so you're usually not external facing, but you are working on everything from, what does our grant structure look like? What does our ad board structure look like? What does our evidence generation and publications look like? So those are some of the key roles. And then again, leading medical information specialists, that's another one that you are managing, but you're not managing MSLs, you're managing the medical information specialists.
Sorry, I tried to unmute myself and I got stuck. All right, so I think that we pretty much covered the questions that we had regarding different roles that you can go into after MSL. So I think that we'll move along to our last section, which we have called Medical Affairs, Leadership, and Mentorship. So to start, what was the most surprising and or difficult part about your first manager position?
Oh gosh, and it's really almost like it's almost funny because it's obvious, but the very first thing is you figure like everyone wants to be a manager, like everyone's going for like the top spot, right? Where you're in charge and you're making the decisions and everyone's thinking just like I am and everyone's motivated by deadlines and product and output. And then you turn around and that's not quite the case, is people are motivated by very different things. So that was probably one of my first learnings that I learned. I had to learn how to downshift. I had to learn how to, all of you have probably done these personality assessments of different types. We've done birds, we've done whatever it is. I advise you to do it, but I'm someone who, I see the goal and I just want to get there. And I forget that I have to tell people the details along the way. So that was probably my biggest thing, is learning that. The other thing is kind of taking a pause and just figuring out if things don't feel right or it's just not a good day and it seems like everyone's upset and everyone's ornery, just taking a DISC criteria. That's exactly it. The birds are the DISC. And that's a great one. If you can do that one, do the DISC. I just saw it pop up in the chat. But that's really a big one. I think the hardest thing is I hate giving bad news. I am just like the Pollyanna kid. It's sunshine and rainbows and unicorns every day. And as a manager, there's a lot of bad news, whether you have to let someone go, whether you have to say, with COVID, whether there were furloughs, whether you have to tell someone that you're making their territory smaller, whether you're changing who they report to, whether you're telling someone, no, you can't attend this conference, or even if someone turns something in that's not very good. And so I had to work on not just how to deliver that, but how to make it productive. How to, almost, I think the best advice I was given was to ask someone what their feelings were on something before I launched into my direction. So those were probably the biggest things that I learned early on. And something that I take with me, and it's beyond my MSL role too, is really figuring out what hill you want to die on, that phrase, and saying, is this a hill worth dying on? And probably not, and just letting a lot of things go if they really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. Because it's depending on the size of your team, you have to pick which hill you're going to die on. And it has to be the biggest one, and it has to really matter.
Yeah, I think that's a really realistic answer that you gave. I'm sure there are many days that are, you have to give bad news or lay people off that, you don't want to do, but you have to do as a manager. So that kind of leads us into one of our final questions. Somebody was wondering, do you have any recommendations for how to approach voicing concerns about personal growth or happiness in your current position without offending your team or managers?
I loved this question when I saw this. And if you have a manager who doesn't want to hear concerns or that you're unhappy, you're probably in a spot where you might want to start looking for a different manager. Your manager needs you just as much as you need them. And so your manager, it's going to be hard to hear, 360 reviews are tough, but I put together a few slides as far as mentorship and leadership. And one of the things they say is never pass up a chance to be assessed. And for you to tell your manager what's working and what's not working, it's going to be hard for them to hear it. It's going to be uncomfortable, but there's no way to fix anything if not. I just have to go back to what I spoke to before, though, and bring it to them with that problem solution resolution. Why are you unhappy and what might make you less unhappy? And if it's an unrealistic solution, then say, I know that this is something that's always going to make me unhappy. What can I do instead? And what are our alternatives? I mean, I've had MSLs move territories. I've had MSLs, change their days. I've had MSLs who just had to take some time off. They needed to take 60 days, just get out of the field. I had MSLs who had to, there's so many different challenges that you encounter. So I would say my advice is to bring it, voice them, but go gently, think it out. I always write things down. Whenever I have bad news or hard news, I write down what I'm going to say. And I find even writing it down is hard. So when I sit there trying to write it down, it takes me so long. I'm like, imagine if you did this just speaking, it would have been a disaster. So if you take your time to write it down, it will be delivered, I think, a little bit softer.
Yeah, definitely. So speaking of all of those things, do you have any mentorship or leadership tips to share with the audience?
I do, and I'm going to share my screen just because I want to make sure I hit them all. I wrote these down because I think they're all important, and they're things that I've kind of kept track of over the years. And so we've already talked about things to increase your marketability, but these are some mentorship pearls. In mentorship, if you are a mentor or you're looking for a mentor, it has to be a partnership. You both have to be responsible for the success. So if you take part in a mentorship program, either as the mentee or the mentor, you both have to show up ready to work. And the other thing that I ask, especially, and you're saying what's something else you can do in your early days as an MSL, never show up to a one-on-one call with a blank slate. Show up with a list. Even if you make up things on the list, show up with a list of things you want to talk about, and you should be driving that call. Don't have your manager drive that call. They'll probably have things they want to talk to you about, but show up with that list. As far as mentorships, I always say have more than one mentor. And I have so many, I call them friendtors in my life. And friendtors are so important because you can be so blunt and so honest with your friendtors because they're also your friend. And they're going to be blunt and honest with you. And so it's kind of like that check that you need. I have a lot of friendtors that are in the same space, which to me has been invaluable. If I'm struggling with something or I can't make a decision, or even if I'm like, hey, I know you were just hiring for this territory. I know that you must have had 2 finalists and you didn't hire number 2, and I'm hiring now. Can I have your number 2? So, from a professional standpoint, it's been really great and awesome. I already said, don't be afraid to step away from the crowd on the small things it'll make when you have to go out there and do big things better. Please build bridges. Don't burn them in every aspect, from joining a company to just integrity. I have to say integrity is a big deal. Never pass up that opportunity to be assessed. and continually assess yourself. What do you like? What are you good at? Am I happy? Just like the question we asked, and is it working? Because if you're unhappy in an MSL role and you're traveling, it's just going to blow up eventually, and you're not going to be very good. There's no way you could sustain that if you're unhappy, because there's so many things on the road that make you unhappy, from 20 minutes to get a cup of coffee, which is normally in your kitchen 2 seconds away, to delayed flights, missed flights, to rental car things. There's so many things that can go wrong. So you need to make sure that you're happy in your role. Leadership, like I said, take a pause, downshift. Is this a hill to die on? No matter what phase of your career. And I have to say, we're all victims of this. And I probably just spoke for an hour, so I'm not being fair, but we have 2 ears to listen and 1 mouth to speak, and that's by design. The biggest thing you could do as an MSL, even in your face-to-face visits, is to do a lot of listening. Stand by your convictions. If something doesn't feel right, especially from a compliance perspective, stand by your convictions. You will never get fired for doing something that just didn't feel, smell, look, touch right to you. And if you do, then you definitely have a leg to stand on, because it shouldn't happen. Never let a day go by where you don't take a personal inventory. Be honest with yourself. Don't say, I just have to get through this next week and it'll be better. Take your chances, accept that not every decision will be the right one. Those failures, and many of you know this who have worked at a bench top or tried a treatment with a patient that didn't work, you're going to fail. It's going to come your way. My scientist friends, you failed 95% of the time, and you're still here to tell the tale, and you learned something when you failed. And I know that sounds like kumbaya and warm and fuzzy, but it really is true. Like, failing hurts, it stinks. But if you do your work and you figure out why you failed, either at the role or in a discussion with someone that you're leading, it's bound to work out in the end. So those are my tips, my leadership and mentorship pearls.
Yeah, those are great. Those are all really good tips for everybody to keep in mind. I do notice that we're coming up on the hour, so we don't want to keep you too long, but I think what we'll do is Renee and I usually like to ask our speakers one final question, which is, what do you wish you had known before starting your role as an MSL? Whether it's something about how the career ends up working out, if it's something how it affects your personal life, anything that you wish you knew before.
I think I wish I knew how big it was. When I first made that leap to industry, I mean, I spent so much of my life in research papers and writing grants and knowing so much about a specific area. And when I went to industry, I had no idea what I was in for. Just the different arms and the FDA and applications. And I mean, that was 10, 11 years ago. And just not appreciating how vast industry is. I wish I knew. I think it was only described to me as like the dark side or this, but nobody explained to me how big and complex and just really how cool it is, though. I mean, it's the other side of it, and how robust it is, and how many brilliant minds are out there creating solutions in the healthcare space, and just how much of an engine it takes to create one solution.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I still have no idea how large it is. Every day I'm like, I can't believe all of this exists, because you never really hear about it unless you reach out to people and you're actually in it. That's really the best way to learn about it all. So I think that's a really great point that you bring up. So thank you so much for all of this. I think everybody in the audience really appreciates you being here as much as Lindsay and I do. And all of those insights were really great. I saw people nodding their heads the entire time, and we're getting some little clapping hands reactions. So we just wanted to let you know how much we appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts and perspectives with us.
Thank you. And I appreciate you too for coming up with this. It's such an asset. It really is. And I'm going to share it with my MSL team too, so that they know they can follow some of the YouTube videos that you have.
Yes.
Great.
That sounds great.
Thank you all. And yeah, reach out on LinkedIn, get connected.
Awesome.
Right,
well, thank you
good.
so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.